On June 14, 1930, Congress abolished the Federal Narcotics Control Board and replaced it with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The FBN was within the Treasury Department. A month later, President Hoover appointed Harry J. Anslinger commissioner of the FBN. Anslinger served as FBN commissioner until 1962. Anslinger is a hero or a villain, depending on which side of the marijuana issue one comes down on. During the 1920s and 30s, rising crime and anti-Mexican bias led to calls for marijuana prohibition. Anslinger and the FBN answered that call. However, at this time in American history, the federal government was weaker than it is today. As the U.S. Constitution was then understood, the federal government had very limited regulatory power because most such powers rested with the individual states. This was before the New Deal and its expansion of federal authority. So rather than seek a federal strategy, Anslinger pursued a national regulatory regime through uniform state laws. Under Anslinger's influence, the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws adopted the Uniform State Narcotic Drug Act on September 15, 1932. Importantly, this act classified marijuana as a narcotic. Once the Uniform Act was adopted, Anslinger and the FBN aggressively lobbied state legislatures to enact it. However, by March 1935, only 10 states had done so. So, the FBN began a propaganda campaign against the so-called marijuana menace. This campaign had the support of the Hearst newspaper chain, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the World Narcotic Defense Association, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the Young Women's Christian Association, the National Parent-Teacher Association, and the National Councils of Catholic Men and Women. Collectively, these and other groups were called Anslinger's Army. This propaganda campaign also included the infamous 1936 movie Reefer Madness. This movie was also known as Tell Your Children and Doped Youth, depending on where and when the film was shown. Within 1 year of Anslinger's propaganda campaign, 28 states had adopted the Uniform Act. Notably during this time, the American pharmaceutical industry resisted marijuana prohibition on the grounds that marijuana had legitimate medicinal benefits. Recall that the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 was upheld as a revenue-raising law pursuant to Congress's tax power. By the late 1930s, however, the law operated more as a drug prohibition statute and less as a revenue-raising law. Now, in response to the violence associated with the alcohol prohibition, Congress passed the National Firearms Act in 1934. This law required gun sellers to pay a $200 tax for every gun that they sold. Max Sonzinski was convicted of violating this act, and he appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Sonzinski v. United States, decided in 1937, the court approved of a prohibitive tax. That is, a tax primarily designed to prohibit conduct and not to raise revenue. Now that the courts had approved prohibitive taxes, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. This act placed a tax on the sale of cannabis. Anslinger aggressively lobbied Congress in favor of the Marijuana Tax Act. However, the American Medical Association objected to the MTA on the grounds that it would stop scientific research on medical marijuana. In the end, the New Deal Congress was predisposed to robust federal action, so they ignored the AMA's concerns and passed the Marijuana Tax Act. So, from 1938 to 1951, in the aftermath of the MTA, most marijuana grew wildly, medical research on medicinal marijuana was virtually non-existent, and possession and transfer of marijuana was a federal crime.